Right, good morning everybody. It is 10 o'clock. We are ready to roll. We are just about quorate. We've got a few people missing, but we'll go first of all with apologies.
Thank you, Chair. We've had apologies from Councillor Francis and Cabinet Member Councillor Parry.
Okay. There are a few other absences, so maybe we'll have a few people join during the early stage of the meeting. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations? Councillor Pert.
I'll get used to using these machines at some stage. Declaration of interest in relation to item number 5, governance of outside bodies. I'm referred to within as the representative on some of those outside bodies. Thank you.
Any other declarations?
Likewise for me, please. There's mention of, I think, one or two of us on those, on that particular subject. Thank you.
Okay, take those and note them. We'll go on to item 3, which is the minutes of the meeting which was held on the 27th of February. Are there any alterations necessary and amendments? Or can I take them as read? Right. Thank you. Which brings us to item 4, which is the civil contingencies update. And it's a report of the Leader of the Council.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing us to present this report this morning. The civil contingencies update needs to come back to this committee on a fairly regular basis. And I think probably I can best capture it fairly succinctly, which is with civil contingencies, when something goes wrong, the public will be saying, why didn't they think of that? So the role of this committee is this morning is to look through what we've been thinking about, and I use the royal we because actually it's Mrs. Thorley's done most of the thinking on this, and say, is there anything that we have missed? Now, the relevance of this, of course, is the COVID pandemic. Our contingency planning had been based around influenza, and the COVID pandemic was something that perhaps was unanticipated, as how could it be anticipated, one might argue. But I suppose the thing that we're looking for here this morning is for the brains of this committee to take a look at this and say, well, why haven't you thought about this? Why haven't you thought about that? Because as sure as eggs is eggs, when something comes up, the public will be asking of us why we hadn't prepared for an eventuality that they feel we should have had the foresight to identify. So that's my preamble. If I could hand over, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, to Mrs. Tracy Thorley to do some more detail on the report.
Thank you. I'm assuming you've all seen the report, so I won't go through it in great detail. I'll just highlight some bits out for you. And as the leaders said, for me it is about your feedback, especially because you talk to the communities and residents, which is helpful for me then to make sure that we are giving them the assurance that they want from a civil contingency point of view. And then to look at the work plan that we've got set for next year, both for ourselves and the Staffordshire Resilience Forum, and then also just whether you would find an annual report either coming back to this committee or audit and standards from a compliance point of view. That's something we don't currently do, but I do feel probably would be a benefit to the authority. So just going through then the background, so on point 4, paragraph 4, I wasn't sure how much people knew about the civil contingency, but for me, this report was about giving some awareness to the committee. What I was asked about was with regard to our preparedness over winter, but this is the first committee meeting that I could get to, so I know winter's over, so apologies for that. And then in point 5, it was just to make you aware that obviously we are a Cat 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act, and we deliver this both through key staff within the County Council, but also as part of the Staffordshire Resilience Forum, which is a partnership. There's about 28 organisations in there, Blue Light, water companies, etc., as well as the voluntary sector, all form part of that partnership across Staffordshire. We do have combined plans, we do have combined protocols, and we do test those on a regular basis and have exercises on those. Last year we did see, in 2022, government came out and started to engage on the consultation of the Act, because, like it says, it's in 2004, so it's quite a bit out of date. So we are looking forward to what comes back from that. And then the development of the UK National Resilience Strategy, that was literally just published. So we have done a bit of work to see where we, from a legislation and compliance point of view, we fit in as a local authority. So point 7 then just covers some of the key priorities that the Staffordshire Resilience Forum are picking up as a collective. I wasn't sure if you want to catch my attention then, Chair. No, so I'll carry on. Then point 8, that's just around, as the leader described, moving from COVID. What we have realised, and most businesses and local authorities have realised, that your business continuity isn't fit for purpose anymore, because we used to look at things like buildings, people, etc. That isn't where we need it now. It is around that supply chain resilience, because people can work from, you know, anywhere. But I just wanted to point out in 8, as well as we've been doing the work, as well as we were dealing with COVID, there were some other incidents that were going on. If not, I mean, probably a number of you have been pulled into, especially around the evacuation and the resettlement of the Afghans and the Ukrainian refugees, and then the amount of disruption that we've had from the supply chain, and then more recently around national strikes, which is obviously continuing this week as well. So point 9 then just covers some of what I talked about earlier, the exercises in the events that we've got and that we've taken part of. So some of these are run multi-agency, so they're run by the Staffordshire Resilience Forum, and then there's some that we run ourselves as a local authority, such as we've recently done a cyber desktop with ICT to test both their resilience and their response both in hours and out of hours, which was done by an facilitated externally for us and actually came out really well. We were really impressed how well we stood up to it. Point 10 then, I've just given you some descriptions of some of the multi-agency exercises that have gone on, so covering flooding, national power outage, the multi-concurrent operational winter pressures, which was done alongside NHS partners, fuel disruption, energy shortages, and then all the lessons learned from those exercises, we're now reviewing our plans and seeing what we need to update within our plans. Point 12 just shows you some of the other risks that we've been considering, so things like food supply contamination or major social care provider failure, which obviously we see quite a bit of, unfortunately. Water infrastructure failure or loss of drinking water, gas supply, and then industrial action with regard to very fuel specific. That one is, rather than the industrial action that we're seeing at the moment. So for 2023-24, so for the next year, we know we need to do a big piece around business continuity. As I've said, they're not really fit for purpose now as they're written, the templates as they're written. We have got the critical services list. That's just been updated again, and we'll go to Corporate Governance Working Group for sign-off and the senior leadership team. The gap analysis that we're doing has highlighted that business continuity awareness isn't as strong as it could be. So that's something that we will be focusing on for the next 12 months to make sure everybody is aware of their responsibilities as far as civil contingency goes. A big piece of work is around organisational resilience in the supply chain. So a recent internal audit that went to, I think it went to Audit and Standards Committee last month, highlighted 3 high and 4 medium recommendations for the organisation. because we've got individual business continuity plans, but what we haven't got is that overarching strategy as to what would we do if there was major provider failure or supply chain failure that is not necessarily our provider, but a sub-provider of our provider. And that's something that we're working on over the next sort of 12 months. Like I say, the gap analysis then, this is about looking at all the legislation, the standards and best practice. What I will do is I'll send to Mandy a list of all the legislation that covers civil contingency, because it was quite eye-opening to me, some of the ones, and there was one that we weren't even aware of, which was a pipeline act that we have some responsibilities for, and radiation. Radiation, we're fine because we haven't got any sites. Where we've got to develop a plan is because most of the time they use the M6 to carry from one place to another, or the A50, so we do need a plan just in case anything happens with somebody moving equipment, etc. So it is acknowledged that, you know, there's a lot of work that goes on across the organisation, but it can be strengthened. So like I said, we're looking at a comms plan, especially around members, being really clear, what's your role, what support can we give you, what are you being asked for by your residents, therefore how can we give you those answers in advance rather than when an incident's happening. So that's it as far as the report goes, other than just going back to probably the ask of the committee, which is, you know, really just to acknowledge the work that's gone on so far, look at the priorities that we've so far planned for the next 12 months, and then really whether you think an annual report would be of use. And then any other questions?
Councillor Perks.
Thank you, and thank you for making an important report, but sometimes how would I phrase it? An interesting area. That it's been thoroughly researched and there are no gaps. I did have a couple of questions. I guess the first one was, we can always dream up new areas that, you know, we might want to look at in terms of the exercises that you've done. But there seem to be certainly two broad areas that I was surprised weren't on the list. One was relating to cyber attacks, both coming into this organisation, but also, you know, no IT working at all. And you could link that to no money, because actually most of the things that you try and find a solution for involve money, and actually if there is no currency and there is nothing that we can pay for, then it becomes a very much more difficult conversation. So that was one area I was surprised wasn't on the list. And the second one was multiple regression. Because one of the things that I think we learned from COVID was that actually if you have 2 or 3 things happening all at the same stage, then actually your original contingency that you were going to use suddenly is shot out the water. So for example, you know, there are movements of nuclear waste and nuclear weapons through the county. What happens if something happens with that and something else? Maybe there's a third party whose hand is in the middle of that, and that's quite deliberate maybe. But I was surprised that there wasn't those sort of specific areas looked at. So that was the first question. And the second was, have we done any benchmarking with other local authorities? And I'm not suggesting that our communities look like other local authority communities, but actually some of this is about the process that you go through and the thinking that goes through, and have we done any of that piece just to really make sure that, you know, all the lessons learned from across the country have been factored in, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time, because particularly when you talk about a process. Thank you, Chair.
Another question?
Thank you. So the first one, the cyber, we have done one recently since the report. And we did that across a number of partners, so local authorities as well, and with Stoke, which I'm more than happy to share the learning with the committee. But for us, we know it did stand up really well. perhaps I shouldn't say this, but less so for Stoke probably, and health partners. So we do look at, there are different elements that we look at. It is a really good point. We haven't looked at no money exercise, to be fair, and that's something that I can raise. Again, it might be worth doing that as a multi-agency, because it might be that, like we say, districts and boroughs, if you think what was happening through COVID, you know, the testing, etc., they just didn't have the money or the resources in the roundest sense to be able to respond to it, and we took up that role. And then we do what we call concurrent exercises again. So we do test whether, and again, we've done one recently where we will test, but we don't tell the people who are turning up for exercise that there are two. So the recent one that we did was around with the voluntary sector. So it was then we were trying to call on volunteers to come and do the work. Well, actually, they've all gone. So what are you doing with regard to the voluntary sector? And then actually the communications went down, which is the hardest one for us to answer. That is, I suppose, the hardest element at the minute is how would we communicate with each other if telecoms went down? That's nobody's got the answer to that either nationally. We are looking at what we can do with regard to, we've got RayNet and other things that we can use, radio wave. But actually, if we were taken out en masse, we've got to think of what are those other ways that we can either communicate with residents to explain to them what they need to do, but also staff as well. And then the second part of your question, benchmarking. Yeah, interesting. We have just done one. There aren't many that are set up the way that we're set up, but that appears to be the way that National are going. They're starting to say that you need what we've got, a civil contingency unit and an SRF. So a lot of other, especially some of the counties do, but there aren't many for us to go to be able to benchmark. But benchmarking ourselves against other local authorities, that's part of the gap analysis that I want done, to see are we ahead of the game. From what I'm hearing from the LRF, so the Local Resilience Forum, they are saying we are ahead of the game. We have got the plans. We work really well as a partnership. The piece that we're doing next is a piece around the third sector, voluntary sector. So we've got a project that's going on at the moment where we're working with the voluntary sector to say, okay, how could we initiate you as a mass, as volunteers, and what would that framework look like? Because that's one thing we learnt in COVID. Everybody was pulling on the same set of people because they probably volunteer at the hospital, they'll volunteer at a number of places, St John's, etc., who are all pulling on the same set of people. So we're trying to all come together as a partnership to say, okay, what's the criteria where we could call on people to make it fair?
Mr. Purr, you want to come back?
Yes, please. Thank you for those detailed answers, and great to hear that Staffordshire is leading the way in terms of the Strategic Resilience Framework and Forum. Just in terms of those tests, are they desktop or are they live?
Live,
right. Thank you.
We do, sorry, I will get used to it. We do both, so some are virtual, some are face-to-face, depends on the exercise. So sometimes we might do it desktop. So the ICT one was desktop, but they were all in a room with the computers. But the majority, we try and do face-to-face with partners as well.
Through you, Chair. When you say face-to-face, do you mean actually sort of out in situ?
So we're normally out at Fire HQ, partly because they've got, or Police HQ, because they've got big spaces, or sometimes in our Rudyard and Trenton.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Yates.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and yes, and thank you very much for a pretty comprehensive report. Just picking up on what Councillor Peart said, I had been making some notes, and one of the things which I haven't been able to find on there is CBRN, which is the chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear. I mean, we have obviously had an incident at Salisbury in the recent past, which caused the extended closure of a large town centre. And we are in a very uncertain world at this moment in time, you know, with external threats getting ever closer. And we have obviously got quite an extensive motorway network running through, which, you know, could involve chemical spills, biological agents being released and whatever radiological and you know, goodness forbid, nuclear problems, especially if there's, you know, with the rail network and things like that. So in some respects, I'd expect that to fit in on a comment on page 21, which is the mass displacement and sheltering. And I think that's something which needs to be exploring as well as the logistics around that and who would be brought in to do that. The other aspect is very much on the cyber side, and, you know, where do we store a backup system? Is it all on hard disk here, or do we have it sort of in the cloud, and is that sort of replicated so we have got an emergency default if system 1 falls down, can we move over to system 2? And also following on that, the comments with regard to mobile telephone connectivity and whatever, have we got a relationship with a, you know, whether at county level or at national level to go to one of the satellite providers like Starlink, for example, which allows you to get, you know, move away from the ground-based masts and ground-based interference, even if it's a sort of limited arrangement and whatever. And finally, because it was very close to home in the Stafford Moorlands, is that we've got a strong relationship with High Peak, and around about 2.5 years ago, we had almost a catastrophic dam failure at Whaley Bridge, which took an enormous resource away from the Staffordshire Moorlands, and it was, you know, there was a national response involved with all as well, and that included the evacuation of a large number of residents in a relatively open urban area, open rural area where there wasn't really that many places for them to go. So I'd just like to give that as an example to stress that these things could happen at a moment's notice. So we do need that level of preparation. So, you know, a little bit of expansion on that and be fine. But principally, it's the absence of CBRN, which is, to me, is absolutely relevant. It is an area I do some work in as well, so I'm very phased on that.
Tracy, do you want to respond?
I remembered this down. We do have a plan, so we do have a Staffordshire plan that covers us for the CBRN. Which I'll more than happy send a link around. We don't really get involved in the multi-agency element of that because it tends to be fire, police, etc. And those are normally driven nationally or at least regionally. They do get tested at least every 3 years. So what would probably be useful is me sending you the plan. So those that have included within the report are only the ones we've done over the last 12 months. We do have a cycle of the big plans, so like mass displacement. We will test those every 3 years, so we do have a schedule of all the plans. We try and tie them into the same exercises, so we're not pulling agencies together. But the next one that we have planned is Operation Fortitude, which is, I can't think of the word now, terrorists. So again, we'll build in elements within there to say, so that would normally be driven by the police, but we'll build extra elements in there to test the local authority plans as well. So that might be mass transportation, etc., because it may be at a bit like, unfortunately, the Manchester Arena, you know, places such as that. So yeah, I'm more than happy to, I'll send you a link to the plan, and happy again to have any feedback with regard to that. As far as ICT goes, we do have some on-prem, well, what we call on-prem, so our own kit. There's some in Stafford, there's some over at Trenton Lakes, so that's our secondary, they're the 2 data sites. But we've got the ICT strategy is more moved to the cloud, therefore it's not sitting with us, but we have to be really realistic. You've handed over a lot of your control once we move it to the cloud, unless people have got it written within their contracts, the response rate from whoever the third party is. And again, that links back to the piece that we want to do with regard to supply chain failure. Because if we move to the cloud, everybody assumes ICT will be able to get it back for them. That may not be the case if that person's either suffering something or they're responding to however many suppliers they're looking after. So that's why we wanted to do that supply chain one. But yes, we've already got that resilience built in across the 2 sites and then moving to the cloud. Mobile, I hadn't heard of Starlink, so I will pick that up with, because we have been looking at what can we do other than the reliant on mobile satellite. Like I say, we have got Raynet, we have got Radio Wave, but again, it's about what are those other options that we can look at. And I couldn't agree more. On the Whaley Bridge, what we got called in as that because what will happen is we have mutual aid across, I mean, obviously you've got it nationally if we've got any specialisms, but we have it with our bordering. So we sent some of our civil contingency officers over to support as well, because, you know, you never know when we might need it from them if something happens, say, on the M6 or something. So.
Councillor Yates, did you want to follow up?
Yes, just on a couple of points on that. On the CBRN, I do appreciate that. It's a very national-based response, I accept that. However, there obviously is the local knowledge which would liaise in, and obviously there'd be local liaison support. And do we have a contingency reserve stock of appropriate PPE, you know, for those people in the emergency to sort of solve it out? I don't want to particularly overplay that. It's just basically, I think COVID showed us quite a few lessons with regards to appropriate PPE in the right places and being able to access it and get that. With regards to cyber and disaster recovery, do we have is there such a thing as a core disconnected hard disk drive somewhere which is kept securely in a safe away from internet sort of interference and attacks? So if everything failed, we could pull it out and at least operate some systems as a contingency, so to speak, as a standalone sort of rearguard action. I think that would work quite well. And yeah, with regard to satellite internet, there are a couple of Starlink. I'm not sure if Starlink is actually the UK system or whether it's the Mr. But I know the UK have invested in a system which is really designated for corporate institutions and national institutions. So I think that's probably the one to look at. But at least it is remote and away from that. So I think that's an interesting thing. But otherwise, yeah, thank you. And I look forward to receiving the information on the CBRN. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take Councillor Peters.
Yes, thank you. Just going back to your earlier comments about volunteers for various activities we're involved in. I am one, but look at the demographic of most members of volunteers groups. They're in close to bus pass ages and all sorts of things to do with being aged. Very experienced, got a lot to offer. But I just wonder whether there's a real challenge for you, and how active are you to try and help encourage much younger people? Now, I've tried it and it's difficult, and of course you have to be mindful of their business commitments, their work commitments, and their family commitments. But I wonder whether that is an avenue that you've thought about, and whether there's a need to react to that fairly smartly, really. Thank you.
To you, Tracy.
So as part of the project that they're about to start with the voluntary sector, that is an element, that's one of the key elements within there. We've lost a lot of, if you think we used to have like cadets, etc., didn't we? The police used to have theirs, that you would then draw people into that volunteering at a younger age that would then normally carry on with it. So that is one of the key work streams within that project, to try and get that, because we recognise sometimes we can get the volunteers, but they may not be able to drive, they may not be able to get to the place where we need to get them to. But I would say within COVID, we were really surprised when it came to work that we were doing in a specific community. Actually, we did get a lot of young people coming out and helping. I think the benefit of that was they were on furlough, therefore, like you say, your point, that they aren't working, therefore they could give that time. But that is something that we're looking at as part of that project, yeah. And if there's any avenues, if you've tried it yourself, if there's any avenues that you can point us down, then I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, the COVID experience, I think a lot of younger people were sort of motivated by the fact that they had a loved one who was in some difficulties, and they had a neighbour and a friend, so they really stepped up and wanted to help as many people as they could. But of course, keeping that momentum going is difficult, isn't it? But thank you for that answer.
Back to Councillor Yates.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a point of information, the UK invested company is OneWeb, which was brought out of issues by the UK government, and it's accelerated quite a pace, and it is very much a world leader in its technology, and that gives secure satellite communications for corporate and governmental organisations independent of strange American people or Canadians.
Okay, thanks for that information. Councillor Pert.
Thank you. Just picking up on Councillor Peters' question. I wonder whether there is some advantage trying to create a database at some stage of skill sets for people. Particularly, you know, not just members, but, you know, members of staff, people who we know we can call on because they may be doing one job, but they've got a range of other skills that they bring to the equation, which we don't always know about. And maybe trying to keep something relatively up to date without being cumbersome. Because actually, if we've got a range of people who can turn their hands to things where there are gaps, it means you can at least do some of the planning on the fly, which, you know, often in these situations you need to be doing that. And doing a shout out isn't quite as alacrious as it could be. That was just sort of just a reflection on the answer that came there. The other question I'd got in my mind is a bit of a left field question. One of the things we learned from COVID was that there was technology sitting around that could do amazing things like, you know, holding virtual meetings and joining people up. What other technology is sitting around that could be better used that we know nothing about because the IT, I was going to say geeks, the IT people haven't bothered telling us or haven't found a practical application for, and is there a range of other things that we can pick up and use, please?
The leaders indicated.
Yeah, I think that's one of those Donald Rumsfeld questions, isn't it? Known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. So in answer to your point, it's hard to know, isn't it, until it arrives. But I think the thing that we do is scan all the time for potential opportunities and looking around the world to see what's available, like Starlink being used in Ukraine, particularly. But then the point you made about Mr. Musk is that, you know, you're always in hock to an individual who might decide to pull it at some point, and that then leaves you vulnerable to other areas. As far as the point about redeployment is concerned, skill sets, there is an element of that goes on within HR, within Staffordshire County Council already. I certainly, when I'm doing the induction meetings with new members of staff, seek to find out the other things that they're interested in. And there are some amazing people in the organisation, and there's generally about 30 or so, 30 plus new starters each month to Staffordshire County Council, and to see their range of skills is quite something. But we found with COVID that as Mrs. Thorley was running the incident management team at the time, just drawing on staff and saying, have you got anything you can offer, is something that really worked well, because some posts didn't become redundant so much as there wasn't really much for them to do during the course of COVID, but there were other areas of the organisation where there was a real lot that needed to be done, and that ability to redeploy is something that something we found really beneficial. But layered into that, another aspect of HR that's worth contemplating is that managers are sometimes a little bit, well, this is my area, and you're not having my staff to help out in another part of the organisation. So not only do we need to understand the skill sets that sit underneath people's job roles that they have that we're not necessarily aware of, but we also need to be training the management in leadership, flexible leadership in times of crisis. We got there in the end with COVID, but there was a little bit of a, no, these people work in my department and I want them staying in my department. So I think that's something that we need to bear in mind. On the volunteers thing, Mr. Chairman, I think we can potentially connect this to the next report, because as we see the number of outside bodies that we're participating in, I think that that's also indicative of the reduction in the numbers of things going on, organisations that we participate in, and I'll come on to that in the next item. I wanted to add something about Mrs. Thorley's point about communications and our role as councillors. I remember in the 2007 floods, my then county councillor, I think his name was Matthew Ellis, turned up in my village, which was underwater, and starts pointing, going, don't do that, move over there. What? This was to the fire brigade. And the fire officers were going, what? So it's really important that county councillors, who the communities look to lead in times like this, know what their role is and the limits of their abilities to influence activity on the ground. A county councillor turning up and sort of giving the impression that they know everything and they can solve everything doesn't always help, because it causes confusion on the ground, and people then start to think to themselves, what on earth is going on? So Mrs. Thorley's point about the communication of this to councillors, and you understanding your role and you understanding what the response is likely to be in certain circumstances is really quite vital, so that you can direct people to the right places, because people will look to you when there is a crisis for an answer.
Thanks. I warned Councillor Yates that you might mention a story about flooding in your area. Next is Councillor Heath.
Important because this subject's way above my brain score, but I hope you aren't classing us all as Matthews. I hope you aren't putting us all in the same category as Matthews. If I went to some of my villages, I'd be in the grid with the water. And, you know, there's an old saying, isn't there? Necessity is the mother of invention. And when COVID came, things were needed, things got done. It might be old-fashioned saying, but it's still there, isn't it? When you're up against the wall, you turn your hand to something, don't you? Sorry, I'm a bit too basic for this conversation.
A couple of things from me. We've been asked for anything that we think might be missing that would be helpful in the policy. And I think the one thing for me that I would like to see is some form of description of how gold command is determined. We've skirted around this subject a little bit, but Councillor White will remember Elford being underwater. And we'll also remember that Nina Dawes was given gold command responsibility for dealing with the floods, because it didn't affect just Lichfield District, it went into West Midlands and Worcestershire, and the chief executives for the various districts got involved in coordination of a flood that didn't respect county boundaries. So as I remember it, I think the district council, Lichfield District Council, had gold command in that particular case. And I think there needs to be something in the policy that says this will be agreed very early on, where the county sits and where the district sits. And it's all very easy to say that when you don't know what it is that you're going to plan for. But we now have the experience of how to deal with a pandemic. And for instance, what I detected was the case was the district dealt with things like shopping missions and getting pharmaceuticals to people. And the county dealt with PPE and vaccination programs and emergency food supplies. And very quickly, somehow, the authorities managed to organise themselves around getting specialist responsibilities. So I think what's needed is a sort of, at least a section to say there will be a gold command. It will be determined as to who has that gold command, and perhaps it needs to say that districts and boroughs will liaise with the county to make sure they don't get in each other's way. Because I've actually had responsibility at Lichfield District Council for civil contingencies, and I've seen a very similar document to this one, which is, I'm sure, exists in every district and borough. So rather than reinventing the wheel, what we need to say is there has to be specialisms, and there has to be a sort of recognition that there is a time when the county will take over and a time when the districts and boroughs will.
That's a really good point. It is missing out of our policy. It does sit in the Staffordshire Resilience Policy, because we have to define whether it's us, fire, police, etc. So which Cat 1 responder, excuse me, is going to take gold command. And it isn't always the same throughout the exercise, and we continually review that. So something like flooding, normally it would start with fire brigade as an example, but because we're the flooding agency, we then very quickly take over, working with the districts and boroughs. So I remember working on the one with Burton, you know, and very quickly the county, because unfortunately they couldn't get a local council there, they were doing what they needed to do on the patch, so we actually took their role for them and actually chaired it. But you are spot on, it does need adding into our policy to say, because it is very clear within there at what points we'll make those decisions and where in certain scenarios they go to. So I'll make sure it's added within ours as well. Thank you.
And sort of aligned to that is another comment that I'd make with, if you like, the experience of seeing this from another perspective in Warwickshire. Because I work in local government in Warwickshire, and the county there has contacted parishes to say, in the event of a major disaster, we will need to requisition your buildings. And that sort of pre-discussion is quite useful, because they said, well, if we have a plane come down or a major pandemic or a train crash or a air disaster, you know, we've got to have somewhere where we can take the survivors, you know, and that sort of thing. So on behalf of my local council where I'm involved, I know that our buildings are, you know, going to be requisitioned. They're going to be made available. And that's all part of, you know, being sensible at the stage of non-panic. But if there's a document that somebody can pull out of the drawer and say, oh yes, but this has been agreed, it might never happen, you know, for another 10 years, but somebody can say, yes, you're on a list that says we can have your facilities.
We will have that for rest centres, so some of the bigger districts and boroughs, they tend to be obviously their own buildings, but again, it's a good point I can pick up with the districts and boroughs about working with parish councils, because it would fall to the district or borough to actually facilitate that, but I can pick that up with the SRF as well.
No other speakers, so I think we need to address this other issue, which I briefly mentioned to Councillor Worthington about whether audit oversees this on a frequent basis. I'm not so sure it needs to be annual, because we're sort of in the throes of dealing with the pandemic, and we might have had a fuel crisis, but hopefully these things don't crop up too often. And I think the idea of discussing it annually is probably a bit too frequent. I did briefly suggest we might, Councillor Worthington, we might do it slightly different. Councillor Worthington.
Yeah, obviously, as Chair of Audit and Standards, I think, you know, elections are 4-yearly cycles, so it would make more sense to me, because you just don't know who's going to be around in these 4 years. That it should be a 4-yearly cycle, not annual. I think annual's too often with changing circumstances. I think my main worry is, obviously my wife's Polish. I know the Polish people are very concerned about the trouble in Ukraine. I think we should be more worried about the fact that we're helping the Ukraine, that we might get something we don't want. So, you know, it might be a major civil liability, which obviously then the police take control. Because remember, when I was a special constable, I had a special little booklet telling me what would happen in the event of a nuclear display on the United Kingdom. I think sometimes the general public don't know what goes on, sadly. But I certainly knew when I was a special constable, and I think it's making people aware of what's really going to happen or may happen in the future. That's my personal opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I tend to agree that once every 4 years is a good cycle, because you get fresh ideas every time. You get people actually looking at it afresh, rather than sort of saying, oh, this is that report that's come back again, and becoming a bit samey. Don't know if anybody else has got any other comments on that. Councillor Pert.
I was just reflecting on Mrs Thorley's comment that the cycle is a 3-year cycle that they go through, and maybe we would be better not reflecting on our cycle, but actually on the cycle that they go through the exercises in. Otherwise, we're at risk of being out of their cycle.
Worthington?
Yeah, I can quite agree that if there's a bit of a joined-up thinking there, I can go along with that proposal. I certainly think 1 year is far too quick. Thank you.
It seems there's a bit of a consensus on a 3-year cycle then. Is everybody happy with that? Yeah. Okay.
Tracy wants to come.
Tracy.
So it is going to audit and standards rather than here, just so as I'm clear.
Yeah, that's the other thing as to whether it needs to come to this committee or to the audit committee, and I tend to favour audit. Okay. Councillor Yates.
Yes, just one little bit of clarification. I mean, we have come up with a couple of suggestions to tidy up some things which appear to be amiss, you know, with regard to cyber security and mobile phones, things like that, never mind CBRM, which is a more national thing. How is that going to be communicated back as addressed within the report and added in the report? Are we going to have a review of this, or does that go to the audit committee to sort of say that, you know, they have looked at this and yes, it's robust, or we've added this paragraph and things? It's just the feedback to close it off for the next 3-year cycle, if you know what I mean. You know, it's not 3 years from presenting the report, it's 3 years from having an approved, finalised report, if you know what I mean. Sorry, Chair.
Let the leader come in.
Yeah, so the political responsibility for this sits with me, and so the points that have been made at this committee, I'll ensure that they're incorporated into the thinking of the unit, and that the response is modified accordingly. And I can get back to you via Tracy to let you know that that's happened. If that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're happy that we've seen it as a first pass, and we've agreed it should go to audit. And I think we've agreed the 3-year cycle. I think the detail now is very much down to the leader to include on the first version of it that goes to audit. Yep, that's well. It's whatever cycle of meetings audit might have.
Yes. To demonstrate to you that it is done, we can get it back to you in 4 weeks, and there's no, I'm not sure it needs to go to committee at that point. Just to let you know that it's been done. Yep.
It'll come back to us for four weeks just to review, but it'll be the audit committee that then takes it forward. Okay, that's item 4. Go to item 5, which is governance of outside bodies, and we've got Chris Eberly here. And the leader as well. Who's going to lead on this? Okay.
If I can start us off. Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure this is going to take quite as much detailed interrogation as the previous item. When I started at Staffordshire County Council, we had, and Councillor Heath will recall this, we had pages and pages and pages of outside bodies. And as a councillor, you'd find yourself with 12, 15, 20 outside bodies to be on. And it was clear that some of those outside bodies didn't really exist in anything other than people's imaginations. So what I was quite keen to do as the leader was, once COVID was out of the way, just review our outside bodies and make sure that those that we are dispatching people to represent Staffordshire County Council exist, that they want us present, and that we are adding value to their work. Now, the process of doing this tends to rationalise the number of outside bodies. There are new outside bodies being created all the time, and it's important that we're also aware of those too, because if you as councillors find that there's something else going on that Staffordshire County Council needs to be a part of, we need to also have the ability to get an invitation to those things and make it an official duty so you can claim for your expenses to get to those meetings. So in front of you, you've got the list of outside bodies. Now, the process that we've gone through to get to this point, Mr. Eberly can speak to that, but you'll see in the appendix some that are green, which is, you know, we're going to keep going with those, some that are amber, which they'll be kept under review, and some are red, which is recommended that we wind them up and take them off the official list. Now, without your say-so, we won't take it off. If you say, no, you're wrong on that, that should stay on, then it will stay on. But it's a fairly ruthless look at it, but I think it's pragmatic to make sure that it's up to date and we're performing our duties as expected in each of those. So if I can hand over to Mr. Eberly just for some of the details of the process, Mr. Chairman, that's my way of introduction.
Pass to you then, Chris.
Thank you, Leader. Good morning, colleagues. So, as the Leader's already said, a quite copious list. So, at the start of this piece of work, 157 member appointments to, I think, just under 100 outside bodies themselves. So, in terms of the actual piece of work itself, there was phase 1 of the research. So, you recall that prior to when this was last brought to corporate scrutiny in December, we wrote to you all as individual members who serve on outside bodies to complete a feedback report. And the detail is in the report in terms of the response rates that we had, which led us down to phase 2. which was basically going out to all of the outside bodies themselves and confirming whether they were still active and whether the contact that we had for them was the correct point of contact, and if there was any particular issues that we need to be aware of or any changes. The research itself was painstakingly slow. Responses came in slowly and we had to do a lot of chasing, which didn't really give us a lot of confidence in terms of the actual list. So we did continue to chase, and you'll see that I think it's been a worthwhile exercise, and the results are summarised in Table 1 and in completeness at Table 1 of the appendices. As you can see, through that sort of exercise that we've done, we've been able to establish that 21 actual outside bodies themselves have been dissolved and no longer operate. I think what's frustrating, and maybe it's just the way of the world, is that they didn't inform. We had no way of knowing that they had dissolved until we actually asked them the question. But at least now we know the situation. So as the recommendation is in the report, 21 bodies can be removed with your permission. Moving on, with persistent chasing, we were still waiting at the time of publishing this report, 3 responses still outstanding, so the recommendation is that we add that to the amber list to keep on review. And so in terms of the recommendations, those are listed within the report. So to get rid of the ones that are the red, to continue reviewing the amber list, and to continue to have the green list as our list of outside bodies, which the leader will continue to appoint to on an annual basis. Just on that last point, though, the third and final recommendation of to sort of have this annual review, taking on board what was said in the last discussion on the previous agenda item, I'm acutely aware of sort of sometimes it being overdone. And so if we were to do it sort of annually. And so the recommendation was, as we wrote it at the time, that we would include and sort of do that annual survey with members, and also to sort of regularly contact the outside bodies themselves. So with your permission, Chairman, I'd like to sort of slightly amend that recommendation and for your discussion, is that we acknowledge the issue of the frequency of the reviews and the time that it does take. So maybe suggest that we sort of alternate that. So we do periodic reviews with the outside bodies themselves, and then we alternate that with going to the members individually asking for their feedback. Whether we do that biannually or whether we do that every 4 years, I'll leave that for your discussion. But I think going back to the last discussion that took place in December at this committee, there was a real strong view I took away from that committee that you as members, if you were appointed to a particular outside body, you knew what the issues were for your outside body, but you didn't know what was going on across the other sort of 100 or so. So what we'd really like to do is, as part of that review, however often that review is to feed back to either through this committee or through sort of other channels, be it the members' bulletin or whatever, in terms of really communicating what's going on and linking it to that last agenda item again about the volunteer aspect of civil contingencies. You know, it's great that we've got this list. It's great that we've got members appointed to them, and they're clearly getting something from it, but what are we as the local authority getting from that? So only by doing that review are we going to get that information back. So it's just one for the committee to ponder. I'm happy to take any questions, Chairman.
Just comments, Councillor Worthington.
Yeah, thank Chris for this. It must have been a difficult job because getting a response from councillors is very difficult. But again, I don't think an annual review is required on something like this, because I remember, like Alan said, the number of pages we had of reams and reams, and they never met. So people were appointed to these boards and never ever met. So I think it's important that we get these ones that are, on red, get them deleted. And I know I sit on the Cautionary Land Charity, and I think it's very useful as a county council to sit on these boards. So I think it was an excellent job you've done, and well done. Thank you.
Mr. Yates.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, very, very interesting read, looking at some of the organisations which we attend. I think the way forward may be, I mean, Excel's a fantastic programme, isn't it, to sort of log things and things. Why don't we request that councillors who attend do a report? Which, hang on. It's a radical suggestion that a councillor becomes accountable, I know. But why don't we suggest that a councillor does a report, even if it's just a pre-organised form on A4? That would allow that report to be logged in an Excel spreadsheet, and that would allow it to be reviewed as an overview by an officer, to sort of highlight where something hasn't happened and then just use that as an highlight of the critical few, so that you're not continually asking the question, does a forum or committee or an organisation exist, because obviously it is live. You're just focusing on the critical few which haven't reported. Therefore, is it the fact that somebody didn't attend, or is it the fact that that particular organisation has lapsed? So it's not so much the fact checking up on the council and what work they've done. It's more a sort of aid to focus the effort for this laborious task of questioning everybody. And the other thing is, when you put pen to paper and put a report, you can actually flag that report. If it's a case of logging and noting, then it goes to Chris. If it's something which is pertinent and requires action, then obviously it can be circulated for that action. So, you know, I'm on committees at Staffordshire Moorlands, which I represent nationally. And if there's something, I don't do it for every meeting, but if there's something pertinent, I make sure the leader gets it and the head of finance gets it on the particular one which I do. So, you know, just a thought.
May I respond to that, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman?
I think
So thank you for your suggestion. You know what's coming next. But no, I wouldn't be asking or seeking to impose upon councillors a written report from their outside bodies. My view is that a councillor comes into this with good intentions, and that they understand the expectations that are placed on them by either individually if they're independents, or by their political parties if they're affiliated to a political party, and the people that hold those councillors to account are the electorate. And if it's clear to the electorate that the councillor's not doing a good job, then the electorate will do what the electorate does every 4 years and swap out the councillor. So, and then the other thing is you're left with the question of a so what. So you write the report, it goes into member and democratic services. Then what? Who's going to action the points? Is it a? You know, I can see a whole series of issues that would arise as a consequence of that. And so I'm going to say it's an interesting suggestion, but it's not one that I would be wanting to pick up and impose upon the council. In any event, being leader is not something that I don't impose myself on you. It's the councillors bestow me the honour of being the leader of the council. And I think if I start chucking my weight around and saying, well, do this, do that, blah, 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 I very quickly find myself out of a job.
Councillor Yates, did you want to respond, or you take that as read?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I could say I'm speechless. No, what I'm trying to sort of get at in some respects is just to see the continuation of the existence in reducing the workload for something which is obviously a laborious task. And I did qualify by saying that it could, instead of being, you know, we're not looking for a tome of paperwork, you're just looking for an acknowledgement that, yes, this is live, this is exist, this is the workforce which they do. So I'm not looking at something which, I respect your position, I know exactly what you're saying. You know, it's not the way I work, I'm sorry to say, but, you know, but I just think it would be very good to close that sort of feedback loop and help the member services really to sort of make sure that that list is manageable and maintained, and most importantly relevant. And if help is required, you know, that is a feedback loop to make sure that help happens. So I can see both sides. I'm not going to push the issue, but you know, it's just it's closing the feedback loop as much as anything.
Chris, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so if I may offer some sort of compromise to this, I think what came out in some of the sort of not the responses that we had, and there's a real danger that we create a real sort of industry of this, you know, by and that's what we're trying to avoid. And as the leader just mentioned, the very simple survey that we sent out in September of last year couldn't have been any simpler in terms of and the response still wasn't great. So my suggestion as the alternative is the compromise is to have we do reporting by exception basis, because some of the feedback that we got back from members was that they weren't fully clear on what actually outside body they were serving on. So I think there's more that we can do as officers to support you as members in terms of what your role is with the outside bodies. I think we've got to remind ourselves as well that, you know, I'm not making excuses, but with 62 members, About a quarter of those were brand new members in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic. A lot of these outside bodies probably didn't meet. We all know the reasons why they didn't meet. So I think there's been that lull of sort of activity with outside bodies and that lack of understanding from particularly the new members of what their role was. So I think we can build on that and then really introduce the exception reporting that if there's an issue, because I don't know if members would know who to go with if there was an issue that came out from their outside body. So I think there's more that can be done.
Bring the leader back in.
Yeah, I want to be very clear about this. This was the process, the rationale behind this was not to make an industry out of it. It was simply to review the outside bodies to make sure that those that we were to whittle it down from dozens of pages just to those ones that are really relevant, and then move on. Really, that was it. And actually, the decision to delete some of those outside bodies, bring that back here, check you're okay with it, rather than sort of create this. I don't use the word pejoratively, the bureaucracy associated with it. I was really rather hoping we would keep it pretty slick and understand what outside bodies we were on and that they were relevant.
Okay, your hope that this was less time than civil contingencies is going to be blown. We've got 4 indications now. Councillor Thompson.
Mine's really simple. What I must have missed why some of them are in white.
So they are where we've got substitute members. So we'll have one appointed member by the leader and then maybe 2 or 3 substitutes in their absence. And I think that was actually some of the real sort of cause of confusion of people were substitutes but thought they were the... So we were getting responses from the substitute member but not the actual member who's been appointed. Yeah.
I was going to say, because I'm down as a substitute for Biffa, but I tend to go more than Paul. I don't think I've ever seen Paul. They come to me first. No disrespect to Paul, but I've got a good relationship with them. So I tend to go. So I think we need to swap us over.
That's the feedback we want, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what Councillor Yates has referred. But it's...
But I think I did put that in my response to yourselves when I filled the form in. I just growl, I like Biffa, that's all. Sorry, I'll just text him and tell him I've got him into trouble.
Okay, we've got 3 more indications, and it's something that's amused me. They're all beginning with P. We've got Perry, Peters and Pert in that order. Councillor Perry.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the report. Can I just ask, are all the outside bodies on these lists? Because there's one on there that there's one missing, I think, unless I've missed it, and that's the Ibstock, Essington Quarry, Ibstock. I can't see it anywhere unless I'm, you know, it's all muddled in. That's just one question. Most of the outside bodies I sit on are liaison groups with quarries, etc. And there's always an officer there anyway. And it's usually members of the public or people that have been designated from the parish councils that come to these meetings. I can see one on there that's in red, which has got Bernard's name by it. Now, I don't know whether Bernard, I think he's been to one, but I'm invited to these. They ring me up as a local member because it's a dual member division. So they don't bother to look to see who's the outside body person, councillor. So I have attended at least 3. Not of the Ibstock one, I'm talking about Campions Wood. And I'd hate to see that come off there because there's always issues with Campions Wood Quarry. So I'm concerned about that on this list. I think when I filled the form in, I did say that on the form that I sent back to you when you asked about these, that I wasn't the actual member, but I do call the meetings and get the residents there to with their issues. So that was the 2 questions I wanted, or 3 that I wanted to ask. I don't know whether you can answer those for me, please. Thank you.
Would you take those away or answer now?
I'll take them away if that's okay. And because I'll come back to you separately if that's okay, Councillor Parry.
Okay.
Decision, haven't we, on the red ones today, and this is on the red sheet, the red ones to be taken off.
I'll bring the leader in.
Mr. Chairman, we'll not be taking the red ones off until we've verified in more detail. So this is precisely why this has come to this committee. So we'll have to pause that deletion.
I think the simplest thing is that we'll take the red ones off unless there's by exception you've got a reason why you think that they shouldn't.
We'll have to double check everything.
Okay. Councillor Peters.
Thank you. The point that Mr. Eberly made at the beginning, how difficult it was to generate a lot of interest, I'd just like to suggest that if UHDB had been in that category, you should have mentioned it to me. And I just wondered whether you would think that a member who is or isn't appointed, who should be appointed to that body, could help get the other end of it engaged with you. Not to have the debate that you want, but just to prompt them to get engaged with you. And at UHDB, I mean, I feel really privileged to be at UHDB. If I have anything to report by exception, and very rarely there is anything, I take the opportunity to go via the chair of Health Scrutiny, who's a first-class chap. And if there's anything to add to Health Scrutiny agendas related to UHDB, he will see if he can weave it into an agenda at some point. So that the point by reporting by exception and how do we follow it up, I think there is a link there. I don't want to make it too difficult for the chair of Health Scrutiny, but until he tells me to back off, I get my answers that way.
Mandy, did you get that for the minutes? Yeah.
So I pay you the £5 an hour?
Speaker's Councillor Pert.
Thank you, Chair. When we come to agreeing to remove the red ones, I'm absolutely in agreement, because actually simplicity means we can focus a bit more on the really important things. Notwithstanding the great work that many of these outside bodies do, and we should probably just reflect on that because they do. I guess if I look at the ones that are still in green, they fall into two categories. One is they're hyper-local, you know, a quarry in a local members award division. And I think that, you know, having those strategic links, I think, is really important. But equally, there are some strategic cross-cutting bodies here. And actually having a better understanding for one or two cross-cutting strategic bodies in terms of their strategic direction, so that they work hand in glove with the county councils, I think is good. You know, for example, West Midlands Rail. And making sure that alignment is working in the right direction, I think, is a really important thing. And maybe if they were to send us a copy of their annual report, the committee's annual report, that's the right place to be able to find what that outside body is doing and delivering for the residents of Staffordshire, because that's really what we're interested in. You know, I don't mind how many meetings they have. I don't mind who turns up at the meetings. You know, I'm interested in their strategic output, and that it's aligned with where our residents want it to go.
Councillor Yates.
Yes, thank you. There is one red one, Bemsley Civic Amenities Site Management Committee, which is Councillor Flunders, who's the Biddle South and Endon division. I think that's actually quite a pertinent one, to be honest, and I'd like to see that one resurrected. That's very close to Biddle Town Council's heart, because there is potentially an awful lot which could be done there in respect to climate change commitments. The fact that it's a non-agricultural site which is prime for development of solar panels, if nothing else. So I'm just wondering whether and picking up the comments about you know, some of the other ones where they should be active, the other quarry-based one, perhaps just a note to the individual representatives just to confirm that this is what you're planning to do, and see what it is, because I'll certainly make overtures to Councillor Flunder with regard to that. I think it's just the fact that it's COVID's got in the way, and one or two noisy people have gone a little bit quiet, but I think there's so much more which could be done with some of these quarry sites and things, and I think it's a good for them to prevent them having to be reinvented in the future if we can get them kick-started again.
Chris, you want to come in?
If I may, not to sort of get too bogged down in detail, but I've just gone to our sort of master spreadsheet. The Bemsley Wood one, Councillor Yates, we were informed by a senior officer that that group was dissolved and no longer in action. But well, if the need, I think, how long do we keep on having things on a list if they're not going to meet? I think can always resurrect it if we need to. And sorry, in response to Councillor Perry, the Campion Wood Quarry, we were just not getting any responses from them. And so in terms of our own research, in terms of looking at companies' house records, the quarry itself was closed in 2018.
Wood Quarry is going full force.
Right,
Yeah.
we'll need to look at
I've
that
had
in
at
more
least 3
detail then.
meetings up there
But I
last
think
year.
it came to a point where we've...
Yeah.
So probably we probably need to then amend that one to be that amber as opposed to a red.
If I can come through you, Chairman, Amy attends the meetings. Amy, the officer. Yeah. So have a word with Amy, who it might be, because I think it has changed hands, but it's going full force, and there are lots of issues.
So Yates, you want to come back?
Yeah, just picking up on that one, the reason I say he probably wants resurrecting is that I think the remit of what he was originally formed for, which is the fact it was a coal mining open cast site, and then making sure that it was reclaimed and put back, and you know the wagons and trucks didn't affect the neighbours and things, is quite valid. But in some respects, I mean the world's moved on. Our climate change commitment and looking for potential sites to help mitigate that are becoming more and more permanent. And this is a key site identified by Biddulph Town Council where work could be done for the benefit of the whole of our county, so to speak. So I think as much as take it off, but don't be surprised if it comes back and reinvented in a new theme. That's all I was saying. If there was any sort of continual existence at any level whatsoever, it is easier to resurrect than it is to renew in some respects, but perhaps that's the way forward. But the world does move on, and there are different things to talk about on each of these.
Okay, I have a few comments myself on this. First of all, to say thank you to Chris and the team for doing this, because one of the main benefits of doing an exercise like this is you recognise just how out of date it can become and how difficult it is to unravel some of the things that we've spoken about. And to have 21 potentially, or thereabouts, to remove out of 157 just shows how out of date it has become. So first and foremost, to do the exercise that Chris and the team have done is extremely valuable. I think in terms of the conversations I've just heard from Councillors Parry and Yates about some of the organisations that have lost track, just demonstrates they're probably emailing somebody who's left the organisation. I mean, that typically happens when you get people in voluntary organisations or on boards of, volunteer people, and they contact somebody who moves on, and suddenly they say, well, the county's disappeared, and you're saying they've disappeared. So it may well be that at both ends that, if you don't keep the channels open, it becomes more difficult to contact people. So it's certainly worth doing the exercise. You asked a question, Chris, earlier about the frequency, and what I would suggest, and I've seen this at district, is that as soon as you've got a new election, you've got new people on the council, you've got a leader who's got to allocate jobs to new people, that would be the time to have a member perspective on it and look at the usefulness of the representations. So perhaps if it's going to be a biennial thing, to contact the organisations at the 2-year interval. So you've got 2 years followed by 2 years. And I think that would keep it fresh. Certainly think it's worth publishing this on a website so that people know who the representatives are, both from the organisation point of view and the members' point of view. This whole aspect of the substitutes concerns me, that the substitute is doing more than the person that's represented, and that needs to be, by communication. I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong, but just to put it out in the open makes it a bit easier to recognise what we think is the right approach and what we might want to change. And the last thing I want to say while I've got the chance is the discussion that we had about, and Councillor Yates started this, about how you go about reporting back. One of the things that I would suggest that is part of the member discussion of it, which potentially is just after the elections or within the first year of election, is there should be a discussion, and it was a throwaway line that Councillor White mentioned as leader, that there are travel expenses involved here. So those people who are officially representing the council potentially might claim expenses. And I think that's part of the discussion. What is the benefit that the organisation is getting from the twice-a-year meetings that they might be having with some organisation that basically just wants them there for kudos. And I'm not saying that is the case in all cases, but that's maybe part of the discussion, you know, in value judging whether the member's input is really worth it. Does the authority get its benefit back from its costs? Councillor Thompson, I think you wanted to respond.
I just wanted to add that I've just checked my emails that I get from Biffa about meetings and conversations and newsletters, and Paul's not on it. So they're not aware of that Paul is an outside body. They just automatically come to me. I think because I made such a big issue in the area anyway with the problems that we had there, and then when I joined the county, they've just automatically assumed. I just bully my way in, basically. I just tell them I want to be there.
You've just managed to save Paul Snape's bacon by that.
I've just checked because I didn't want to get him into trouble.
Just verify that the email hasn't got Paul's name on it.
It hasn't.
May I come back, Mr. Chairman?
Leader.
Your point about the organisations emailing councillors who are no longer councillors or whatever is really well made, and that's something that we need to, we as a organisation need to reach out to those outside bodies and verify that they know who we've appointed. And if there's a gap with that, as you've highlighted, Councillor Thompson, with your points about Paul Snape's allocation on that particular body, then it's not his fault at all. It's our fault for not letting the organisation know. I think one of the very important things that Councillor Perry's raised is about not just the ongoing liaison with the quarries and particularly coal industry as well, is that these permissions that are in place for extraction of aggregates last for 25 years. And when they're done, the quarry's got to be remediated. And as we go through our 4 yearly cycles, we lose touch with these things. And that then creates a missed opportunity. If a quarry is coming to the end of its life, then we need to be thinking collectively, led by the councillor who's allocated to that body, about what the future looks like. So, for example, in Lichfield District and East Staffs, there's huge areas of aggregates, huge amounts of aggregates have been removed. 60% of the region, the West Midland region aggregates come from that part of Staffordshire. Well, wouldn't it be a great opportunity in that case to create a national water park? You know, let's capitalise upon the damage caused by these things to create an asset that attracts people and industry into and visitors into the county, or some other use. But that requires us to be participating in these outside bodies for the long term. And one of our representatives saying, so what does the future look like? And just constantly banging that drum so that we make sure that we're, for the residents we represent, make sure we're getting the best for them. As far as the organisations disappearing off are concerned, it's a bit like, you know, every so often Aunt Nellie doesn't send you a Christmas card. You think, oh, did Aunt Nellie send me a Christmas card? No, she didn't this year. Must be dead. So it's a bit like that, isn't it? An organisation winds up, and you can't know that it's wound up because they've stopped sending you Christmas cards. So probably a bad illustration, but you get my point. So that's always difficult to keep on top of, but we will be doing our best. So hopefully, Mr. Chairman, we've had a good go at this. But I would, before you sort of close this one out, just change the first recommendation that all outside bodies highlighted in red be removed from the list. Can I suggest there's an amendment to that all outside bodies highlighted in red be reviewed once more prior to deletion?
Okay. Councillor Parry.
Can I just make a comment on something Alan's just raised? No. When you said about the life of the quarry, we had that the Poplars landfill site many years ago. That was going to be all done with lakes and walks and everything. Did it happen? No.
Sorry.
It turned out to be the tip, the digester, the everything else that's come along on that site since. And so just to say that it's in hindsight, it's a wonderful thing to think about in 25 years' time. We're going to have it looking lovely. But unfortunately, if there's still aggregate down there, they'll still want to keep digging.
You want to come back?
Sorry, I jumped in then. Sorry, Kath. We have just got a date for when the landfill has finished now. We are keeping the AD and we are keeping the Amy site, the our site. However, the landfill itself is going to be converted into a nature reserve. There is a date, 19 years we've got left, and that is with the finish. No, it's with the finished effect added in, everything. So it should all be completed by 19 years.
Originally the site for Merry England, by the way.
Okay, have we finished?
Yes, sorry. I just like
Somewhat parochial, that discussion.
Sorry.
Which is what we're trying to avoid. Back to what we are here for, and that's to review a process. I did make the suggestion, it needs to be in the form of recommendation. Councillor White's referred to the fact we will review the red list rather than remove them. But I also made the suggestion that we have a biennial look at the list in two different formats. So in the year after the election, I suggest that members should look after it, and then 2 years on from there, the officers contact the organisations themselves. And that cycle should hopefully keep it front of mind and keep the list up to date. Is everybody happy with that as a suggestion? Yeah. Okay. Right, we'll take that as a recommendation and close item 5. The last item we have on the agenda is the work programme. And hopefully you'll have seen copies circulated. Just to remind you that the 9th of May is now a full meeting. I did ask that it become an afternoon meeting because, you know, as you'll appreciate, some people are going to be busy the week before, some people are going to be busy over the weekend, and some people are going to be hungover on the Monday the 8th. So potentially a 2:30 start on the 9th might be better for attendance. Let's leave it that way. So as far as the work programme is concerned, there are some bigger items that we've had to put back until then. We've got the revised Children's Transformation Programme where we're looking at the budget implications. So we will have certainly Councillors White and Parry, possibly Mark Sutton will be in presence. We're also going to look at the corporate delivery plan, and another one that we've put back but we've been keen to see, which is the volunteering policy, which Councillor Parry and others have mentioned, Councillor Peters as well. So we're off to a flying start with the 9th of May. Is there anything else on the work programme that we need to discuss? Anything else anybody would like to have added to it? No? Okay. We'll take that as read and therefore conclude the meeting. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you. Can I apologise for